Okay, we've reached the final session of today's conference, and I am absolutely delighted that our keynote speaker, Dominic Young, will be furthering the discussion and his thoughts on AI. We've already had a good taster of where we stand on that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dominic. He's going to speak, and then we'll follow with drinks. So Dominic, he's hiding behind the column. Dominic Young.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. It's very nice to be here. It's a bit odd to be here, actually, slightly scary, because I don't come to speak for anyone. I don't represent a particular industry or a particular lobbying position or anything. This is happening because I had a conversation with Sarah a month or two ago at another conference, and we were talking about AI because, of course, we were talking about AI. And she said, "Oh, that's a very interesting perspective. Why don't you come and talk to the conference?" I said, "Yes, that's a great idea." Obviously, now I'm here, it's a slightly more alarming idea. But I thought I think the perspective I've got is partly because I'm kind of an outsider now, even though I've been around this issue for a very long time, and also because I remember this whole debate happening, almost the same thing, 20-something years ago, around the dawn of the internet, and you know, should copyright, amongst other laws, step out of the way of this incredible new innovation and these incredible new businesses, all of which promise the opportunity for Britain and Europe to be the leaders in this fantastic new field, and what a glorious utopian future we all had stretched out before us if only we could make this internet thing work really well. And we've had 25 years or so to think about how well that has actually worked. And I think it's fair to say that most people's experience of the internet is not the glorious, utopian, wondrous thing that it might be. And I think the role of copyright is really, really important in helping shape the future direction of the internet. And I think the current debates that are being had is so refreshing. It's so good to hear the last panel. They've made lots of the points that I was planning to make, which means you might have drinks sooner than you thought. Because I think defending copyright is so important, and I think we're in a better place now than we were before, because what we've been hearing is we do not have a generation of credulous legislators and policymakers who are listening to all the glorious promises being made by tech companies and just believing them and taking them at face value. Now, that really was a problem last time around. There only seemed to be the possibility of losing something if we didn't clear the law out of the way. And I suppose part of my thesis would be we did clear the law out of the way. And what we did was we abolished rules and created anarchy. And what we've got on the internet now is something that quite visibly, when you look at it as a user, isn't really for you. Most people's experience of the internet is really quite negative. It's full of clickbait and disinformation and scams and people masquerading as things they aren't. Everything you see when you go to search results is what's most profitable for the search engine before what's most useful for you. Same thing even on Amazon, where they're selling sponsored ads now to try to push products you don't want above products you actually do want. The incentives we created by clearing the law away, not just copyright law, lots of laws. You know, Section 230 in America made platforms immune from almost every law. That made them invasive species in our world, in the creative industries world. They had no natural sort of friction or resistance, and it created monsters. So when we're talking about the AI platforms now, they're asking for the same thing. They've sort of assumed the same thing. Let's just ignore copyright. That's what an awful lot of digital companies did the first time around. They just ignored copyright, and actually copyright stepped out of the way for an awful lot of them. It would be disastrous for the same thing to happen in this era of AI. And, you know, legislators love to legislate. They love to bring in new laws, but they do it too quickly. There are already text and data mining exceptions, not the huge sweeping exceptions that were being proposed, thank God. But they're already there. And as we've just heard, they were based on an assumption of an outcome that firstly was guaranteed if things were cleared out of the way, and secondly that would be snatched away and there was no other way of achieving it unless barriers were taken away. So what I want to talk about is the opportunities this presents for us as a sector. Firstly, to thrive in the future if we get this right, and to turn around some of the challenges that we've had, and secondly to reopen actually some of the issues that weren't really closed previously but were certainly buried, covered over, and made difficult to re-raise. I should give you a bit of background on me. Some people in the room will know me because I used to be visible in this world. I used to be part of this world a little bit. I used to work for News Corp, and so I managed lots of things, including IP. So I got involved in lots of forums like this, and I also was. You'll detect a thread when I tell you what I'm doing now. I was involved in a few initiatives that were aimed at trying to fix some of the operational issues with copyright on the internet. First one I was involved with and kind of initiated out of a process started by the World Association of Newspapers and the European Publishers Council was a thing called ACAP, Automated Content Access Protocol. ACAP was designed to make permissions machine readable to search crawlers. Guess what? Scraping content was controversial back then too. We didn't want our content scraped by anybody, and we didn't want the way our scraped content was used to be just for anything. And we actually teamed up with Google initially to create ways of saying to the Google crawler and any other crawler, yes, you can scrape this content but not that content, and you can use it for some purposes but not for other purposes. I think when Google realized that would put some serious limits on them, they kind of killed it, and that's a whole other story. But it led to the assumption that scraping was okay, and that what you do with the content. So I think scraping is very not okay. Copyright says you can't copy stuff without permission. That's basically what copyright says. And what scraping involves, and Google admitted it during that process, is copying every single thing they've ever seen on the internet and keeping it permanently. And they only really regard the law as affecting them in terms of what they then expose to the public. What they do behind closed doors, they don't really regard as or they didn't back then anyway, as something that they needed to worry about. And we now know that people who've been scraping content for years and years and years have been doing things behind closed doors that are really quite threatening to us, and developing large language models and so on, which are absolutely not in our interest, and arguably, I think definitely at the moment, not really in the world's interest. These large language models are not producing societal benefits yet that I've noticed. The first thing you know about ChatGPT is that it makes stuff up and presents it very plausibly as something that's believable. How is that something that any business thinks is responsible to put out into the wild? It's crazy. They've done it by just assuming they can, and they're kind of playing chicken with everybody and saying, well, look, this truck is driving towards us. You need to get out of the way, basically. Thankfully, people are not getting out of the way, and I think that's really good news. And I would go further than what was being suggested on the panel just now about licensing. I think the industry, the whole of the creative industries, all of them, do have one common position that they're holding and they need to keep holding. There's lots and lots of divergence on other things, which is you can't copy our stuff without permission. This is not a fair use. This is not exceptional. You can't do it. That needs to be universally heard. It needs to be heard in America. It needs to be heard in Europe. It needs to be heard from the music industry, the film industry, the photography industry, and actually the non-industrial beneficiaries of copyright, which is everybody. Everybody who's ever posted anything online has a copyright work that's out there, and they might want to have a say in how that's used, whether or not their interest in it is primarily commercial. It's a human right too, and I really think it's so important that we defend it. But I think we should then think about how would we do licensing, and in what circumstances might we issue a license. Back in the day when I used to do licensing, there were some licenses I wouldn't issue. The way you do any deal is you look at the value of what you're giving to the other side and the value of what they're giving you, and you balance that, you factor into that risks and so on. And some deals you just won't do. Too risky, not enough benefit, too much risk, too much of a challenge to my core business. So it's all right to not do licensing. And so I would be careful about assuming that licensing means collective licensing, because collective licensing means you have to treat all of the content covered by the collective license as having sort of equivalence of value and having equivalence of sort of risk and reward. And that's not true. I don't think, when it comes to AI. So I'd be careful about that. And I'd be thinking about how we can develop more nuanced licensing models than just simple blanket licensing. But there's a reason why I would not license a large language model right now, which is it's very hard to know the value. It's very hard to know the value for the AI companies because they don't really know the value. They just want to, it's doing that Silicon Valley thing. Let's just do something huge and at some point it'll all make sense. Google was like that. Google didn't have a business model when they launched. They bought an advertising company and that's when they acquired a business model which also, undermined their core purpose, which was to get you off Google as quickly as possible. I don't know what value the content has to a large language model, and I don't know the risk it exposes me to either. I don't know about the reputational risk. If my name, I think as if I'm still a newspaper. I'm not a newspaper, as you can see. But do I want the name of my brand associated with something which makes stuff up and publishes false information and lets it plausibly appear to be true? So not knowing that, there's lots of deals like that. Not knowing the value exchange. Typically what you do with the deal is you say, well, let's make this a very limited deal, and then let's see what happens, and then let's go back and revisit it. That's not possible right now because these large language models have been unleashed on the world recklessly. They haven't built in any mechanism at all for the large language models to unlearn stuff. So training a database is a one-time process. Your material goes into a training database gets used to create the large language model. That's it. They want us to believe it's a bit like humans trying to forget stuff, but it's a real problem. If you can't withdraw a license, how can you ever be certain that what you're giving is on terms that you are happy to accede to perpetually? I think it's really difficult. So I think if we win this debate on licensing, feels like it's going that way, it leads to quite a big, challenging question, and I suppose we should all think about whether we're comfortable with this, which is everything they've done so far is illegal. Do they have to turn it off? I think maybe they do have to turn it off. I think it is a bit like Napster. Napster had quite a good argument on fair use, I thought, which was none of the infringing copies were actually on any Napster system. They weren't doing infringing, they were just pointing at infringements. But they lost, and then they had to switch it off. And when they switched it off, we got Spotify and Apple Music and Amazon Music and a competitive landscape within which businesses have to compete for an audience, have to compete with a better service, have to specialise in to try to make their service distinctive. Isn't that what we want from the AI sector? Don't we want multiple players in the AI sector who are not all using the same training databases and who don't all have access to everything and can just assume access? Wouldn't that create a much stronger, more balanced, symbiotic relationship? Wouldn't it allow publishers and content owners and individuals to strike deals that suit them with AI companies that are doing things that enhance their business? So I think we should be prepared to be brave. A lot of what I hear about when it comes to AI is a sort of assumption that the truck's not going to stop driving and there's no way of changing the direction of travel. We just have to, we hear talk about compensation, that it's just about getting some money. I think we should be prepared to be a little bit bolder than that. But also I think we should be prepared to paint a picture of a better future for the internet and for society if we get some of this stuff right and we maybe push back on some of the things that we have now learned after our optimistic moves 20, 25 years ago haven't worked out. It's all right to paint a negative picture of things that we think might go wrong, but it's much better to paint a positive one too. And so I want to make another point about AI, which hasn't really come up, but I think is really important. I've already tried to paint this picture, I hope it's a familiar one, of an internet which is a bit toxic, quite toxic to users, and has become more toxic. We all experience it every day as time has gone on. The incentives are all wrong, and that means that very often we as users are not the key stakeholders on the internet, and we pay the price. That's going to get worse. It doesn't matter what rules we set in Britain or in Europe or in America, AI technology and the technical ability to scrape content isn't going to go away. And if you're sitting in China or Russia or somewhere else protected from these laws, consequence-free, and you've got a bot farm that's set up to, generate clickbait and ad revenue, or you're busy trying to undermine elections by producing plausible-looking seditious propaganda or whatever it might be, that's not going to go away. So one of the things that I think is inevitable about AI and that we can't reverse is that it is going to rapidly and dramatically increase the toxicity levels that we find on the general internet. And I wonder if, as an industry, the creative industries broadly, there is something that distinguishes us and that makes what we do identifiably different from that toxicity. And I think there is. Some people think it's a subjective thing, and it can be. There's lots of projects in the news industry around certifying good quality, high, reliable, trustworthy news. But I think it's more basic than that. I think a huge proportion of that toxicity is produced by people whose businesses depend, or is promoted by people whose businesses depend on the legal loopholes that were put in place to protect them when they were a nascent player. But they now depend on it. They have to be not liable in law for the consequences of the stuff on their platforms, or else they can't exist. And we've never had that. What you might call the legitimate media has to stand behind every single thing they put out. They can't afford to be ignoring the law. They can't brush questions of defamation aside by saying, oh, well, how am I supposed to know if it's true? They can't ignore copyright and say, well, it would be impossible for me to function if I wasn't ignoring it. Everything we do, we are fully answerable. And I think that is something that makes us distinctive. And I think that as the internet becomes more toxic, being able to find the content, the products that are what you might call, clean. If the internet's a swamp, the dry land that sits above it is something that we ought to be focusing on how, as an industry, we can do together so that it becomes easier for people to make choices and it becomes easier to flag when people maybe ought to be sceptical about some of the things they're seeing. Can we, as an industry, make a virtue of our legitimacy and start to flag it, and how can we do it? It's something that, obviously, by the way, I've got no skin in this game, and I'm not here to promote any particular agenda, but I am an entrepreneur, and I've started a business to try to improve one of the two big foundations of the creative industries. One of them is copyright. If we don't have strong copyright, it starts to crumble. We've seen it on the internet. The other one is reliable business models. Can I make more money by being more popular? That used to be true generally, not so true now. Really terrible scenes in the news industry, which I know well. So the business I've started is about trying to make consumer transactions the norm for interacting with any kind of media. And if we're in a world, if we can build that world where transactions are happening frequently and willingly by consumers who are buying access to products they really like and enjoy, which does characterize the whole of people's interactions with most of the creative industries over history, can we start to create something that is a bit like the internet, but that clean, dry land? Can we create an internet where trust is the norm, accountability is the norm, where people who publish things hold themselves out as accountable, are identifiable, and need to earn the respect and trust of their consumers, because if they don't, their consumers will abandon them and cease to pay them. I think if we can get these two things right, we can use this moment as a transformative one, because I think the internet is getting, I don't know, we've got the dark web, right? Anyone can get on the dark web, but I bet hardly anyone in this room has ever been there. You've got to make a conscious decision to try to get on the dark web. The current internet, because it's getting so sort of polluted, it's kind of turning into the grey web. And is there something else? Can we create this? I was trying to think of a good name for it. I was thinking maybe it's the fourth web, like the fourth estate. The Web 3.0 is just crypto garbage and NFTs, and that's all been exposed as a marketing scam. Is the fourth web something we can actively build? And can we start to build a picture of something better for society, for consumers, for us, that emerges out of what has turned out to be a long-term and rather unfortunate experiment with sweeping away the laws that had led for 300 years or more, since my favourite law, the Statute of Anne, that I never mention anymore because everyone rolls their eyes and gets bored. But when we talk about giving rights over copying to the stakeholders who invested in that creativity, actually the outcomes are pretty good. And when you sweep that away, as the internet has de facto done in some parts, legislatively, what we get is a mess. So is this a moment? Suddenly everyone's focusing on it again. This issue has been unburied by AI and by the recklessness with which the AI companies have just galloped onto the scene. Is this a moment where we can start to point out, particularly to legislators, that there is a better way, and actually, rather than legislating to remove barriers, maybe what they need to do is let a market form. I think we do need to win the fight on copyright. I think that might mean all the existing large language models are illegal. Is that too scary a thing to contemplate? But might they have to go away? There's plenty of people calling for a pause on AI. There's plenty of people saying AI is going to destroy humanity. And this time last year, AI had very little presence in most people's lives other than as a word. Is this a moment when, as an industry, we ought to be encouraging fearlessness, really, about asserting the right which has built the whole of the creative industries and our culture, really, and allowing the consequence of that being that this sort of reckless intrusion onto the scene has to pause. Is that something we can do? I don't know if, well, it's always better as a conversation, but I just wonder if in some ways we're too timid. We're sort of saying, well, we have to start with the status quo. It's only been around for a few months, and we have to build on that and work on that and try to adapt to that reality. Adapting to the internet reality has not served us well over the couple of decades that we've been trying to force ourselves to do it. Maybe we need to be a bit braver about saying, here's the world that we would like. Here's the world in which we think we can thrive and function. Here's the world in which these others, these stakeholders who would like to have access to our stuff need to operate, and they need to come to terms with us, not the other way around, if they want to have access to our material. And some of the stuff that gets talked about, standing back, not involved in the detail of policy anymore, kind of staggers me. This phrase, text and data mining, what a phrase that is. What that's saying, just focus on that word mining. Mining means taking a low-value commodity and turning it into something of higher value. That's a bit of an insulting term to use about our stuff. Actually, when you talk about mining, very often you're talking about digging a hole in the ground and digging up something that nature has put there fortuitously in a particular part of the world. That's not us. We paid for this stuff. We invested in it. We took all the risks. We said, well, we'll take the risks of legal compliance. And how insulting to say this is a low-value commodity that ought to be made available for free and without choice to a whole bunch of people who want to try and turn it into something higher value. It's not hard to turn something into some high-value item if it cost you nothing in the first place. That's no great trick. And by the way, governments should be mindful of this. If someone has discovered a great deposit of some valuable mineral, they don't get to just show up with bulldozers and help themselves. That's not how it works. Mining is something that comes with permission. Permission's a good thing. How do you get permission to do mining? Well, you have to persuade lots of people, the landowners, the people who live nearby, the people who are responsible for protecting the environment, the government. You have to persuade them that it's overall a benefit. You have to pay them money. You have to make promises about not damaging the environment. Text and data mining, I think, the concept of it is something which we should resist strongly. By the way, no AI company needs access to everything. They might want it. In fact, I don't think they do. They're selective, aren't they? They say there's certain things we want to keep out of our large language model because it will damage its quality. Actually, number one thing they want to keep out of their large language models is AI-generated content because it's garbage. So I think we can afford to take a much more assertive position. And if anybody says, but hold on a second, if what you want came true, we'd have to stop doing what we're doing. I think we should be unembarrassed about saying, well, you never asked in the first place. So sorry, but it's a bit foolish to go out into the market with an unfinished product that, by your own admission, is creating massive harms all over the place, and is something you're incapable of stopping. You can't teach it to unlearn things. That must worry governments. We're already hearing stories about generative AI being used to generate child porn. It's shocking, and it's disgraceful. But also, how does it know? How's it capable of doing that? Who taught it how to do that? Is that okay? Is everyone happy that once an AI has learned something, it's impossible to get it to unlearn it? How does that work when it comes to national security issues? How does it work when it comes to libel? How does it work when it comes to injunctions? I think it's just reckless to throw an unfinished technology out into the wild, capable of so much harm, really not capable. I've not heard a compelling, maybe I haven't been reading enough, but I've not heard a compelling rationalization of where all these trillions of dollars are coming from that AI's promised. So, the $1 trillion promise is the one always made for new technology, because the imaginary money can be withdrawn in a trice. It sort of creates a bargaining position that's completely false. I don't know where that's coming from. So I think as an industry, I think one of our positions we should take is, as well as pointing out all of these scary realities, is painting the positive picture of the better outcome, the consumer-focused outcome, the one that is focused on what's good for society, and puts us in the position we've always been in, of standing sort of for everyone, for consumers, for society. The press in particular does that. So I would urge everybody to think hard about the starting point they would choose for how this industry and the other creative industries interact with AI, and not accepting that the point we've reached now is the one we necessarily have to start from. It's still very, very early in the genesis of this technology. It's clearly has aspects that are properly extraordinary, are absolutely revolutionary, and are going to change the world. But that doesn't mean that the first dog out of the trap gets to set the course and set the pace, and everyone else just has to try to follow along. We've made that mistake before. We weren't assertive enough before. We weren't being listened to before. Too many people were believing the hype, and it created massive damage, not just for us as an industry, but for everybody. Look at that toxic internet where no one's responsible or accountable for anything. We are responsible. We are accountable. We're accountable ultimately in courts, if it would ever get there, but it very, very rarely does, because our accountability and our need and willingness to act when mistakes are made happens way, way sooner than that. And I suppose to round off and to obviously get back to sales pitching, right, because I've got a startup and I need to pitch everybody wherever I go. But to round off, I suppose, and to pick up on this point about, and by the way, I'm going to round off soonish, because I hate monologuing and I want everyone to heckle me and to ask questions, and I need to leave some time for that. I want to ask an even more optimistic, maybe bolder question, which is one of the issues. This is very much, I'm taking a news industry perspective here because it slightly obsesses me, and I talk to them all the time in Britain and America in particular. But the current generation of mega platforms, Google, Facebook, really, I suppose, are the main ones, have been big contributors to and generators of this toxic internet. And I think now most people are at least a bit skeptical about those platforms. I think even 3 or 4 years ago, you'd probably find most individuals would say those platforms are very much kind of their friend, even if we as an industry might not have said the same thing. But people are more skeptical. I wonder, can we reduce or even eliminate our dependence on those platforms? The reason they're so scary is because we can't live without them. They get to make all the decisions about everything that they want to happen in their platforms. We know that quite whimsical decisions by those platforms can have quite profound impacts, particularly on news publishers. All of a sudden, the algorithms change and the traffic disappears, and along with it goes the advertising revenue, and yet more news publishers go out of business. But coming back to this vision, dare I say, of a future area of the internet which is populated by identifiably accountable, responsible publishers, I suppose. And, sales pitch, one in which everyone is capable of transacting, so and not having to subscribe and not having to pay huge amounts of money and not having to go through separate sign-ups every time they go from one thing to another, but they're transacting like they do in Sainsbury's, right? Whatever they want, just buying it spontaneously and impulsively, which is how people act on the internet. If that starts to become the norm, can the media collectively redefine the relationship that they have with their audience? Because their audience is really everyone. Media has collectively ultimate reach. It really does speak to everybody every day. Why is it that we can't create an online environment in which we can thrive when we are so much of what is valuable to most people online? Is it possible for the media to start to become independent of those big platforms? I think it is. I think, if copyright is one of the foundations, you don't think it is. Someone's shaking their head. We can have an argument in a second. Excellent. I think it is. And I think if copyright is one of the big foundations that has to be strong for our industry to survive, a viable, scalable business model is the other thing that has to be strong. And if you've got both of those things, you have an industry in which anyone can enter the market, is capable of, if they produce a good enough product that they can attract enough attention to, selling it to everyone in the market, don't have to take them through lots and lots of barriers. We can start to create an industry that I think will be driven by very different incentives, and I think those incentives will drive a very rapid evolution in the products that we're putting out there and the nature of our offer to consumers. And I think I put this out there partly, obviously, to get everyone to sign up to my platform, because then they can do it, and that will be fantastic, and I'll love that. But more importantly, to say that AI is doing us a favour here. AI has asked the question not just about the future of AI technology, not just about the future of our industry as it relates to it, but really the future of the whole of the internet. It's suddenly made the direction of travel less certain and less easy to be sure of, and that means it's a moment when we can influence it. Suddenly, it's not just on a railway track going in the direction that it was built. It could go off in many, many different directions, and I think our moment to try to influence that and to be brave, not even brave, just be willing to be radical about painting the picture of the world, the online world and the offline world that we would like to exist in, and that we think would be better for us and for consumers and for competition and for democracy and for accountability and for transparency. There is a better internet to be built, I think, with the key stakeholders. I think the media has been so key to our culture, to our politics, to our democracies for the last 300 and something years. Going to give Anne the credit for that one. I think we need to get back to it. So I suppose that's my optimistic call to action. I think we need to hold the line on copyright. I think we need to think hard about how we might be willing to do licensing, and I think we should be creative about that. I don't think it's just about compensation. I think it's about a whole new market, and we need to be able to trade in that market, and that means we need to do our own individual deals to suit us as businesses. I think that's the immediate opportunity. I think the AI sector we get as a result of that it'll be like the publishing sector. The giving rights to authors absolutely stimulated the development of a publishing sector. It didn't inhibit it. It was the opposite, and we'll get a much better AI landscape, much less chance, I think, of huge monopolistic mega players dominating that landscape, and a much more plural and competitive AI landscape, which will benefit us and which we can thrive in, and not just by licensing, but by using those tools. There's nothing wrong with AI. Shouldn't object to the technology. It's just the manifestation of the technology right now is so dangerous. And think about how we use this moment to distinguish what we do from this really discredited activity that's increasingly becoming the norm on the internet, and ask ourselves how we as an industry, as a sector, as a society, can start to be independent of these things that have really trapped us for the last 20 years. So to wind up, I think this is a great moment to call everybody to action, not just to address what appear to be the immediate problems, but to take advantage of something we haven't had, well, since the dawn of the internet, really, which is to get the whole framework and the whole environment within which we and they operate normalised back to something we know will work much better and will reduce the toxicity and the darkness that is otherwise looming. I shouldn't end with the word dark, shouldn't I? I should end with the word light. I really do think there's a huge opportunity, and I hope that what I'm done getting up here and just gabbling away is what I think Sarah briefed me to do, which is to offer a perspective from a different angle, from hopefully not just repeating the same things you've been hearing from other people, but giving you, I hope, something else to think about, something else to feel optimistic about, and something else to gather around and gather the industry around, because it's a real moment. Come and speak on this one.
There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'd love to hear some questions for Dominic. But before we go into that, I just wanted to put to you that I'm really with you on everything you've said, but I also think we're in a different environment to where we were when Napster, for example, broke on the scene. And the copyright industries, well, the music industry to be precise, was very much going it alone. You know, in those days, Napster was a wonderful thing, surely. It gave everyone all the music they wanted. The internet was exciting, and, you know, what were these music people doing trying to stop it? We've now seen the other side of the internet. You've talked about the dark net, and we're probably in the grey net, as you say. Regulators, you know, they're very conscious of data protection. They're conscious of how platforms have not been paying their taxes properly or doing their best to pay as little tax as they can. I think those sort of rose-tinted glasses have suddenly fallen away. And so it feels to me like we're not going it alone in the same way. No. And if we want to take a strong stand, this probably is the moment to be doing it.
And offer solutions. Offer solutions. I mean, we were both involved in the Copyright Hub, which went wrong for a whole bunch of reasons. But the idea of the Copyright Hub was essentially that anybody should be able to control the rights in their creations, whether they're Getty Images or you and I. And one thing we should remember about copyright is that one of its main manifestations is really as a sort of form of privacy right. Most of the stuff most of us create is never intended for a wide audience, even if it was posted on some server somewhere. And our ability to control that right is really important. We need to draw that parallel more clearly, because there's loads of people out there who take diametrically opposing views on copyright and privacy. They'll say privacy is sacred, copyright should be loosened. And the reason they do it is because when they think of copyright, they think of Disney and bad people making lots of money unfairly. But actually, one of the number one use cases for copyright is privacy. It's not just a commercial right, it's a human right.
So, do we have any questions for Dominic?
Or challenges.
Or challenges. We've got a couple of minutes. Oh, hands going up. Danielle, could you just mention who you are? And
yeah, my name's Jeff Innes. I'm a consultant to publishers, digital mainly. But I worked on the digital publishing side for 20 years.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a point, and then I don't know if challenge is the right word, maybe encourage, but the point I wanted to make in response to something you said was, can media divorce itself from the big platforms? And I think that's really started to happen, because what they used to get for free, they're now being asked to pay for. Yeah. So people built business models on businesses such as Facebook, and that traffic's gone, and it continues to go. Twitter has let people down. And I think publishers now realise that free doesn't really work. They are trying to walk back to a transactional model, and I think they're getting much, much better at it. In fact, previously free-to-view publishers are now coming up with very good transactional models. So I think, on your point about can we divorce from the big platforms, I think there is hope there for publishers. I think there's a momentum going on. The second bit, you said it yourself, which is the internet's a global platform, unless you're in China, of course. for this vision to work, you can't just be one country doing this. There has to be a joining up. And, you know, internationally, you have competitive, sometimes creative industries trying to, you know, get one up on each other. How do you suggest that a global mandate might be created?
On the first point, anyone who's been paying attention to what's happening in Canada right now will see how much pressure there is now to become independent. What's happened in Canada is the Canadian government has brought in an Australian-style law mandating the big internet platforms to pay news publishers for the content they include in search. And those platforms have responded by saying, we're just going to cut out news completely, we're just going to abandon it. In other words, they've thrown their toys out of the pram and they said, if we can't have stuff on our terms, we won't have it at all. And if there was ever a sign that dependence on those platforms for advertising or for traffic is a folly, that's it, and that's going to keep happening. So I think you're right, and I think actually they're creating their own pressure for everybody to move away, and obviously transactional models is what I'm all about. Roll up, roll up. On the second point, yes, you do sort of need a global mandate. I suppose the observation I'd make is that, firstly, it is possible to create standards. You can make things interoperable in ways that don't necessarily involve creating sort of big monopolistic single solutions, and we haven't been very good at that, certainly in some parts of the publishing industry. But secondly, you can also create models that are capable of being adopted elsewhere. Truth is, at least when it comes to consumers, most media markets are quite territorial in nature. So if you can create a model that works substantially, materially for substantially a sort of a whole market, that's a pretty good place to start. If you start with the ambition of saying, let's try to create a global alliance and everyone gather around the same thing, then as you say, competitive issues creep in, there's far too many people around the table, it gets really hard. My observation about getting certainly the news industry moving is you don't do it by telling them what they should do, you do it by persuading the first in the pack to run off in a different direction, then everyone looks over and goes, where's he going? Starts chasing. Oil tankers don't move easily, you can send people off in speedboats and get stuff done. So I think we have to be quite sort of opportunistic about doing things that work and inviting everyone to join in.
We've probably got time for one more question. I saw Danielle, if you could.
Thank you. Mark Walford from Sage. I was struck by the kind of Napster analogy and the idea that, you know, there's an opportunity here to kind of stop this now and start again with a vision of actually what it could be. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether, because essentially what we'd be relying on is a copyright regime which is largely about damages-based remedies, whether that's strong enough to stop this?
Well, I mean, I suppose where do we draw the line? There's one line which says, I mean, goodness knows when we might cross it. It'll probably happen in America and it'll probably happen as a result of litigation. But where, hopefully, unequivocally, the preceding activities cross the line and they're not legal. And I think that does carry the implication of, well, what do we do? Is there some interim solution? But I don't think we should give in to just focusing on compensation. I think the smart thing to do, not saying this will happen, is not to worry too much about damages for the past infringements and to focus much more on the framework within which we can drive the maximum possible future benefit. The way you do that is by reserving your rights to negotiate and change the state of your licensing as you go forward, as opposed to trying to create a regime today on day one that we want to be fit for purpose indefinitely, or a license that has to be fit for purpose indefinitely because it can't ever be changed or revoked. Long term, if what you're looking to do is to create the maximum possible future value in the market for them and for us, I'd focus much more on that framework than fretting too much about past sins. Sort of, I mean, I'm not saying we should just forgive all that, but we can end up being very tactical and focusing on short-term opportunities to get a big dose of money into our bank accounts, which God knows everyone would love. It's so hard to resist when you're struggling, especially and when money's hard to find. Boy, oh boy, will it feel good to get some, but actually we should think of the long-term cost. By the way, when it comes to Spotify and Napster, dare I say it, and I used to say this to people in the music industry when I was doing the Copyright Hub, the licensing model they adopted for Spotify was folly, because gave unlimited access to music in return for a fixed and limited amount of money, which means that the money in that ecosystem only grows as long as new people are signing up. And when they don't, you've hit peak money. And I'm hearing people in the music industry, and they all said, "Oh no, that's rubbish. It's amazing," and it was amazing. The revenues were shooting up. They got back to where they'd been. This sort of sense of doom and death had gone away. It was incredibly exciting, and it really was working. But now that growth is slowing, now that Spotify have never managed to put their prices up, so they're a third cheaper than they were when they launched now in real terms, they're finding growth hard to find. And so the music industry is now saying, "Oh, maybe we should try and find a different way of doing this." I think we need to take the long view, because those are things that, even if they should have anticipated them, they didn't, but we now see them played out in real life, so we should be taking that same attitude to how we approach licensing with AI.
So, Rosie Glazebrook, Chair of PLS, is going to come up and...
Just say a few words. Really, thank you, and I hope everyone will give Dominic a huge clap. Enormous thanks to Dominic for coming along today, and very thought-provoking last 45 minutes. So huge thanks, Dominic, and I'm sure lots more questions for next time. Also really wanted to thank all the panellists, and that includes the PLS team, but many of you who've participated and really brought the day to life. So many thanks to you. And final thanks is to Esme and the PLS team. I'm not going to name everyone else in the team, but they have done a tremendous job. It's been an excellent conference today, and really hope that all of you have got a really good amount out of it. So thank you for coming and attending. There's drinks outside, so you can carry on the conversations there. But thank you so much, and I hope you'll give us feedback when you receive the note about all that. And we look forward to seeing you next year. So, but thank you very much for coming, and to the team. Great.